You're tuned in to the HR Bandit podcast, your one-way ticket to the latest and craziest in the world of work. In partnership with Timber Media, Podcaster for India Inc. is sponsored by Adrenaline E-Systems Limited.
Hey! Welcome to episode 9 of HR Bandit. It's hard to believe you're almost a year old. If this is your first time here, where have you been hiding? I'm so glad you found us. If this is you returning, an even bigger welcome to you. You are the reason we exist. But where are my manners? For those new to the pod, this is your host, Ankita Podar, still very much hungover from the Valentine's Day marketing. In this episode, I share love on governments around the world. Our theme for this episode is governments and their impact on the future of work. Ireland, my country of residence, has 2 big bills that influence this space. The first one is the right to request for remote work, and the second, gender pay gap reporting. The second one's been adopted by many nations around the world and is a fascinating area to watch. In our last segment of the episode, we are discussing some of our favorite laws that exist or should exist. Wink, wink, mine's a new one from the US of A. But Bandits, the best part of our show, as always, is our guest for today. David Collings is a professor of HRM at Dublin City University Business School in Ireland. He previously held faculty positions at the University of Sheffield and the National University of Ireland, Galway, with visiting positions at King's College London, Nanyang Business School in Singapore, and Cornell University as a Fulbright Scholar. He's an elected member of the Royal Irish Academy and fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and CIPD. He has consulted with many leading global organizations and is amongst the top 2% of cited academics in business and management globally. He has published in leading academic journals in Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review. His work is regularly cited in media and other outlets, including Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and the BBC. David, welcome to what can only be referred to our best episode till date. I am so glad to have you on the show. And I have to ask you, what was your favorite subject growing up? And please don't tell me it's HR.
Thanks so much, Ankita. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. What was my favorite subject in school? Honestly, my favorite subject in school was probably sport. I spent more time playing sport and being involved in sport than I did studying or doing anything I was supposed to do. So I guess on one level it kept me on the straight and narrow, but on another level it probably kept me away from my studies more than I should have.
I actually hated sports in school. I was the kind of person who would fake any kind of illness to get off the ground. The only thing I think I can play to any extent is badminton. Have you ever played badminton?
No, my mom played badminton. No, I played a little tennis when I was younger, but in the end, I spent most of my sporting highlights were on the basketball court. Highlights is a bit generous, but basketball was the sport I was into, so it gave me a lot of fun over the years.
Really? I would have guessed rugby. Like everyone here in this country loves rugby.
Yeah, I wasn't good enough for rugby. I watch it and really enjoy it, but in fact tonight I'm going to watch a game in Limerick, but yeah.
Oh, wow.
I never had the skills for rugby.
Oh, well, never mind. Sports had its space and time, and now you are the really famous HR professor.
Right. I don't know about that.
Well, hopefully our followers of the pod will make you famous, if not anyone else. We'll see. Okay, I'm going to move us to the serious part of our pod. And I'm going to kickstart with a bill that I find endlessly fascinating. The right to request for remote work. Now, this bill requires all employers to have a written policy on working from home. The policy will set out how remote working requests are managed and the conditions that will apply to remote working generally within the business. While an employer can refuse a request for remote work on reasonable grounds, employees will have a right to appeal to the Workplace Relations Commission, WRC, where an employer does not respond to a request, does not give reasonable grounds for a refusal, or penalizes the employee for exercising their right to request remote working. Per usual, Bandits, all the links to what we're discussing today is in the show notes below. Now, There's a lot I love about this bill, but before I tell you why I'm a big fan, David, I'm curious, what do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think fascinating is a great choice of words. I completely agree. It's fascinating. If you think back 2 years ago, it's unimaginable that we would have employment legislation around flexible work. It really was never on the radar to this extent. And I don't think the political will or the public push for it would have been such that we could have ever imagined it happening. So Absolutely. There's no doubt that COVID has just really reset our expectations about the workplace and about people's flexibility in terms of how they approach the workplace. I think while we've seen those changes, I think it's important to remember that, about 60% of people have jobs where they have no discretion. They need to be in the workplace. If you work in healthcare, if you work in retail, so many settings, it isn't really an option to be in the office or not. So this is still, a relatively select group of people who are lucky enough to have jobs which provide this flexibility. About 40% at the peak, I think is what the numbers suggest. So personally, I was really interested to see what the bill would look like when it came forward, because my fear was that it would go too far in terms of the requirements on employers around flexibility. Because I think so much of the narrative in the media and kind of the informal discussion around flexibility is all the benefits it brings for employees and all the great things it does. But actually, there was very little discussion around, some of the downsides of it in the mainstream media. So, the research suggests to us that for the most part, output has been maintained in lots of jobs. So people have been producing about the same level or a little bit more. But actually, what gets lost in that is that much of that excess productivity or maintained output has been through increased working hours. So when actually we get into things like productivity, it's a very different question. When we look at the impacts on not being co-located on our work networks, there's some really interesting research that shows that we double down in our close networks and we kind of get farther away from those in distant networks. So how that plays out in the long term around innovation will be really interesting to see. So I guess my fear was all that hype would mean that the government would kind of go too far in the direction of flexibility. But actually, to be fair, I think they've got the balance about right here. The expectations on an employer to have a policy, I think, are very reasonable. And there's clear kind of guidance in terms of, the expectations in timelines, how long one needs to have worked in the organization to be able to request flexible working, the obligation on the employer to give a response within a period of time, and some very clear and reasonable grounds upon which flexible work can be turned down. So I think in the round, my sense is that this is a pretty decent attempt at trying to find a balance between kind of the opportunities of flexible working for employees and also employers having a context in which they can ensure that they deliver on their business priorities too.
I absolutely agree. I think it is a very well-balanced law. And to the extent that I don't know why so many organizations were lobbying against it. There's a certain fear, I think, whenever the government comes out with a bill saying that it is mandatory. And obviously no organization likes outside interference. So I understand why they were lobbying it. But I think it's a fantastic move for so many reasons. For a lot of organizations which are progressive, they already are considering having such a policy in place to explain to employees what's the process and what's not. But a lot of organizations don't. And even for those which have these policies in place, there's a general fear of retaliation. Like you may feel, I might ask, it will not get granted, but then a certain impression will be formed of me. I think what having such a policy in place does is normalize the conversation. I was also looking at what's stated as reasonable grounds to refuse a request for remote work, and they're fairly well thought out. It has conditions like cannot reorganize work amongst existing staff, planned structural changes, burden of additional cost, potential negative impact on quality or performance, and quite a few others. So I have to say that I'm very impressed with the bill.
Yeah, I think you're right on both points, on the fear from both sides. So from an employer point of view, I think that fear is natural. But actually, if you look at the history of employment legislation in Ireland, certainly over the last 20 or 30 years, the government has generally taken a relatively kind of floor of rights approach to employment legislation. And I think that's partly down to impact and the importance of the FDI sector in Ireland and the multinational sector. So in positioning itself as a location for FDI, Ireland Inc. tries to position itself as somewhere where that kind of balance between employee and employer rights are kind of somewhere in the middle. So that floor of rights, when it comes to kind of transposing EU directives, it's generally kind of the minimum requirements. And then obviously, the hope is that employers, do better than that. And in many instances they do. So I think you're absolutely right. I think the more progressive employers are going to be thinking about this anyway and going to try and create a culture where employees have that balance of flexibility in their work. The fear for employees actually is a really interesting point. And I think that's one that will be interesting to see how it plays out over time. I do have a fear that those employees that spend less time in the workplace are less visible. That somehow will translate into less career opportunities, because we know from the general research that when it comes to things like job opportunities, promotions, we often tend to look closest to us, and those people who are in our networks and those people who are more visible are at an advantage when it comes to those. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how organizations can ensure that those of us that are not co-located in the office or spending significant amount of times on site will not be disadvantaged. I know how the culture of organizations evolves in terms of the messages that senior leaders saying in terms of where they spend their time, for example. So I might kind of have this narrative around flexibility and say you can do what you want, yet I show up every day, 5 days a week in my office and create that expectation for my colleagues that they should be there too. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out over the longer term.
We actually proactively talk a lot about proximity bias because you obviously have employees located around the world, but human nature says that it's not organizations per se, but like if I was seeing someone every day, I'm more likely to fall in love with that person than people I don't see. So it's going to be so hard to change the entire wiring of the human brain to actually not be biased. And I think you're right. It is going to be very interesting to watch how it plays out at the workplace, because you're really going to have to keep consciously stopping yourself from doing what comes most naturally to you.
For sure, yeah. And we, in the academic literature, we talk about bounded rationality, and really simply, that's just when we need to make a complex decision, there's too many variables to consider, so we make shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts is proximity, right? So the first person that ticks most of the boxes, they satisfy the criteria, so I go with them rather than truly looking, doing a broad search and identifying the best person. The first person that ticks all the boxes gets the gig, and that's often the person that's closest. So proximity, there's so much research in different fields that looks at this, and it's a really scientifically, it's something that exists and is a real challenge for organizations to navigate.
Do you have a recommendation on what organizations can do to beat this bias?
Yeah, So some of our research looks at high potential programs, for example, and we know that selection onto high potential programs is often biased in many ways, right? We know performance management is hugely biased as a process, for example. We know that the biggest indicator of variability in somebody's performance rating is their supervisor, not their individual performance per se. So in things like high potential programs, ensuring that we use multiple inputs into those decisions about how people are ranked on talent programs and high potential programs. So yes, using performance data, but also using assessment data, competency profiles, a range of factors feeding into it that to ensure that we have a more complete picture than just the performance data. And I know many organizations do that as well. Other areas where it comes up is, if we think about how we fill roles in organizations, some of the literature talks about, slotting, where a job becomes available. I have somebody in mind that's a high potential candidate. I put them in the job and off we go, right? That generally leads to poorer outcomes in terms of performance. What I really want to do is try and ensure that I have a broader consideration of candidates. So I post those jobs and allow people to apply for them. That's likely to lead to a better selection outcome. Significantly, also ensuring that I have some diverse candidates in that field. So ensuring that, not just those people that put themselves forward, but have a minimum of, a couple of female candidates, a couple of culturally diverse candidates, whatever the kind of the mix of our workforce is. And again, the research would suggest to us that when it comes to those selection decisions, just having one diverse candidate is not enough, because we continue to compare that candidates against the norm, in inverted commas. Whereas if we have multiple diverse candidates, we reach a much more balanced decision. So I think little steps like that can help open up promotion opportunities to wider groups. That's just one example, right?
Yeah, no, that is definitely food for thought. And when you were saying that, the secretary problem came to mind. But obviously, I'm not going to go into mathematics and different algorithms. But there are solutions. It's going against our natural way of how we've always worked.
You're tuned in to the HR Bandit podcast, your one-way ticket to the latest and craziest in the world of work. In partnership with Timber Media, podcaster for India Inc. is sponsored by Adrenaline E-Systems Limited.
I'm going to move us to our second bill under consideration on the episode today, gender pay gap reporting. So France, Germany, UK, Iceland, Canada, and now Ireland have some form of pay gap reporting required. Again, I'm going to use the word fascinating because there are differences between these requirements. For example, UK and Ireland do not require differentiated reporting by job level, job type, or other criteria, whereas Germany has this cut by level. France, on the other hand, announced that it was considering requiring companies to install software directly to their payroll systems to allow the government to monitor any pay gap within their company. Supposedly, this software will cut out the risk that companies choose either not to report or inaccurately report their pay equity figures. The common thread, however, between these laws is that companies are required to share what they're doing in the space of inclusion, diversity, and equity. David, good move, bad move, needs more thought. How would you classify Ireland's new bill?
Yeah, so again, a really, really interesting area. And I think in an ideal world, we would hope that we wouldn't need things like gender pay gap reporting, no more than quotas or some of these other measures that are really aimed at trying to kind of close some of the gaps between genders that we know are very stubborn and continue to exist. I think fundamentally it's a very blunt instrument, and I think it's really important to be realistic about the objectives of gender pay gap reporting, but also that people understand what the numbers mean. I think most kind of the general public, when they see gender pay gap reporting data, assume that means similar jobs. So we're comparing the pay rate for a similar job. And I think that's what most people understand when they see this. But clearly that's not what the legislation in Ireland or the UK certainly are getting at. It's kind of the average of the pay in the organization. So it's much more likely to highlight where we have, a bias at senior levels in the organization to male leaders, than it is to actually highlight whether we're paying people similar levels for similar work. So I think understanding what the data tell us is really important, and being realistic about how much we can learn from this. I think, while a much more complex exercise, I think we learn a lot more by understanding, what the equivalence is in terms of equal pay for equal work. But even that's not black and white. I often think of the example of go back to sport. The US women's soccer team have probably been one of the highest profile advocates globally for equal pay for equal work and looking for equality with their male counterparts. I actually believe that if you look at the profile, the revenue generation, the success of the US women's soccer team, they blow the male team out of the water and are far more profitable as a brand, if you use that terminology, than the men are. So pay equality in that context, actually, it doesn't meet the outcomes that they're achieving. They should be paid more, in my opinion. Whereas if you look at somewhere like Ireland, it's not equivalent, right? The level of exposure of the female of the women's soccer team relative to male. So it's not black and white, right? So in some instances, women may be shortchanged by equal pay for equal work. So this whole idea of pay transparency is really, really interesting. And again, the research evidence does show us that it is really stubborn. Interestingly, one area in my own, and this is in my own research, Lisa Leslie at New York University looked at high potential female leaders. And that's one of the few places where we see the pay gap reverse. So if you're a high potential female leader, there's a possibility that you get paid more because you're so in demand, right? Because organizations are trying to address this gender deficit at senior leadership. If they can spot one golden star who they think will help them do that, they can often end up, paying that person more generously. So that's one of the very rare areas. On some occasions, we see the gender pay gap reverse, but otherwise it's hugely stubborn across organizations across the globe.
There's a lot to pick apart in what you said. First, I absolutely agree. Like, each of these reports needs to come with a whole instruction guide on how to interpret that data. I remember, I think a few years ago, Netflix released its gender report, and they very selectively shared what they wanted to and hid a lot of data. So I love that this is a brute force instrument, but it does push organizations to reflect internally, to actually look at the data more closely, because no one wants a number that is not perfect to be out in the public. And I also like the fact that it asks organization to list what they're doing in the space. So you can't put out something silly like, oh, we've reserved 3% of our board for women. You're going to have to show initiatives right from grassroots to senior management on what you've done to explain the numbers. So I think that is some saving grace. So even if you have say 37% skew, you can say, but these are the initiatives our organization recognizes it. It allows the organizations to start building a public narrative versus just being completely opaque. So there's definitely that benefit that I can.
That's a great point, Anika. I completely agree. I think forcing organizations to be transparent about what they're doing to resolve these issues is a really important step. And I'm always kind of struck by the irony of organizations not being transparent about things like pay. I understand why they do it, but you look at their values and they talk about transparency and openness as values of the organization, and yet things like pay is you don't discuss that, right? That we don't talk about that. Or things like, high potential programs. We're not going to actually even tell you if you're on a high potential list, and we certainly don't want everyone else to know. So we have this kind of tension between the values of transparency and openness and the reality of organization. Another thing that strikes me though on your comment is, if we go back to our previous discussion about remote work, I think it would be really interesting to see how that impacts on diversity and inclusion. We touched on it a little bit, but if you look at some of the discussion now around, people's pay being based on their location, and people, for example, in the US who move out of Silicon Valley back to, other areas being paid less than their counterparts would be for the premium of working in Silicon Valley. Given we know that females are more likely to want to work remotely, the flexibility because of caring responsibilities and other things. It'll be interesting to see whether that translates into kind of an increase in the gender pay gap in some of those organizations. And I think that's a real risk.
I agree. I think organizations can go above and beyond and start slicing different ways to actually show how that works out. I like how the two interconnect and have the potential to actually change the future of work. But I'm going to take us to our last segment. And this is a part that actually hit me just a few days ago. So we're going to talk about our favorite laws or law that the government should consider. I'll go first here. America recently signed a bill that ends forced arbitration at workplaces. And this is a result of what started as the Me Too movement. This is called the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act. It bans the use of the controversial closed-door legal process known as forced or mandatory arbitration to resolve sexual misconduct cases in the workplace. Victims nationwide now have the right to pursue their dispute in a regular court. I think many workplaces won't take to this kindly, again, because organizations like to be opaque to the outside world. And I do think it's a big move to the country. It was a few years in making. So I'm definitely going to keep a close eye on public reception and where it goes from there. But David, a quick comment on what you think about this act, and then tell us what is your favorite law that exists or should exist.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's such a positive development. I think, we've seen, and this is particularly a tradition in non-union companies. So one of the things they like to do is try and keep third parties out of their affairs. And one of the ways they do that is to try and solve these problems with things like these non-disclosure agreements and all the stuff that goes with that. So I think it's hugely positive, and the only people that can benefit from this are employees, which is really positive. So for me, I'm really interested to see how governments around the globe are legislating for gig work and the gig economy. I think it's an area of employment where practice has got ahead of the legislature in almost every country. So we've seen these new platforms emerge as ways of, sometimes connecting people with work or sometimes trying to circumvent some of the legislation that protects and supports employees. And we've seen most countries around the globe really playing catch up and struggling to play catch up. And we see some of the kind of the decisions around whether people are employers or employees or contractors being resolved in the courts. And we've really seen few countries that have got the legislation in place to support that. And it's not easy because the gig world is very complex. You have, our typical gig workers, we think of Uber drivers or the like, but you also have really high-end contractors who are in many ways operating on a similar premise to gig workers. So where the sweet spot is in coming up with some legislation around that, I think that's such an important area of employment legislation going forward. And I'm really interested to see how different countries are thinking about and engaging with those questions.
It came and crossed my mind, but there's a legislature that was recently introduced, I forget which country, where you couldn't penalize an employee for dual income. Organizations have traditionally used that as a means to say you can't have more than one job. But there was a legislature that said you are now allowed to have more than one job. You cannot be fired for it as long as it didn't conflict directly with what your current or either organization is doing. So that, I think, is one move towards recognizing that people may hold more than one job. But I also agree, like when you were speaking, I made a note in my notebooks to talk about, how most of this is resolved when we take it to court. And you said exactly that there's no legislature. So when the organization and employee go to court, they really don't know which way the dice will fall. And having legislature around that is useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that one has to go to court advantages the employer here, right? Because they have the resources and to do that. Whereas it's a much bigger issue for an individual to support that. That legislation you mentioned is really interesting because I think, again, people have multiple jobs or gig jobs for so many reasons. So some people, it's just their passion, right? So my day job pays the bills and I have this kind of side hustle that really is my passion and allows me to do something that really interests me. In many countries, people work multiple jobs just to pay the bills, right? So we've a whole range of reasons why people work multiple jobs that we really need to consider.
Absolutely. I'm hoping at some point I start getting paid for doing this podcast. Right now, then I can say I have a dual income. But well, yes, that is an interesting space to watch. I'm actually wondering, are you aware of any country that has any law or has started thinking in this direction?
So the UK certainly had a government committee that looked at some of the implications of this, and I think it certainly put some resources into thinking about it. I think that may have been kind of slowed down a bit with everything that's happening with COVID, but certainly they were a country where they were putting some investment into this and did establish some government committees to look at it and think about it. Beyond that, I'm not well versed on global employment legislation, but certainly, to your point, I think most countries are resolving this in the courts as opposed to through legislation, which I think is very reactive and also kind of disadvantages the employee side.
Absolutely agree. David, we've spoken a lot about laws that exist, should exist, spoke a lot about work. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And I will reach out to you and tell me who else we should bring to the pod, because it's been such an interesting conversation. But before I let you go, I want you to open up your Netflix watch list with us. I just finished binge watching Inventing Anna, and I don't know what to watch next. So what would you recommend?
Oh, wow, that's a hard question. What would I recommend to watch next? I'm terrible with names. We just watched a movie with Jessie Buckley in it that was nominated for an Oscar, and I can't remember the name of it. I am so terrible.
What are you watching now? Do you watch a lot of Netflix at all, or Prime or whatever?
No, I generally don't watch a ton of TV, to be honest. A lot of TV that I watch is sport, and then it just kind of dip into bits and pieces. We've watched The Sinner recently on Netflix. I thought the early series was really good, but I think like so many of these things, it's run out of steam a little bit. I'm not really a Netflix person, so it's a terrible answer to that question.
No, I'll switch the question around. Tell us your favorite book.
So I've read some really interesting books recently. There's a book, now I can't remember the author's names, by James Suzman called Work, which charts the history of work, which was really fascinating. I can send you the links and we can put them up.
Absolutely. We'll put it in the show notes. I'm sure.
Another book by Adrian Woolrich, who was at the Financial Times, and he wrote an excellent book about the aristocracy of talent, which talks about how people become privileged in different parts of the world and how that translates into career opportunities. So they were two books that were really accessible, really interesting, and really related to things I think about in work and outside of work. So they're two great books that I read recently.
But David, as you were talking about the titles, I realized, like, if you were to ask me to recommend books, even I'd probably talk about things that probably relate to the world of work and everything else. Of course, I do like reading, but I've currently just started a recommendation from one of my friends, and it's called Invisible Women. And this is related to our topic. It's a book by Caroline Perez. It talks about how the world was built for men. I know this is a very controversial topic, but it really goes into data and goes into history and everything else. But I'm definitely going to ask you for the links, put it in the show notes, and also maybe read a little bit of that. Bandits, for you listening, we didn't get the Netflix watch list from David. So if you have recommendations on what to watch, please tweet them to me at Ankita Podar or message me on LinkedIn. I want to know what you're watching. While I'm asking for that, please don't forget to share the pod with your friends, colleagues, or anyone you can think of. David, your students too.
For sure.
Ask them to listen. But any last words before we close?
No, thanks so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to listening to the rest of the future episodes on the podcast, and it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you, David. It was my pleasure. And on behalf of NHRDN, David, and I, we are out.
You're tuned in to the HR Bandit podcast. your one-way ticket to the latest and craziest in the world of work. In partnership with Timber Media, podcaster for India Inc. is sponsored by Adrenaline E-Systems Limited.